In 54 AD, the most powerful empire on earth fell into the hands of a teenager. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents. Its armies guarded frontiers thousands of miles long. Its wealth flowed from every corner of the Mediterranean. Millions lived under Roman authority. And now, that immense power belonged to a 16-year-old boy. His name was Nero. At first, few feared him. In fact, many Romans were optimistic. The young emperor appeared intelligent, educated, and charismatic. He had been guided by some of the finest minds in Rome, including the philosopher Seneca the Younger. Influential advisors surrounded him. Stability seemed likely. The empire expected a promising ruler. Instead, it would receive one of history's most controversial emperors. During the early years of Nero's reign, things appeared surprisingly successful. Taxes were reduced. Public support remained high. Government functioned effectively. Many later historians would admit that the beginning of his rule looked remarkably stable. But beneath the surface, another side of Nero was already emerging. A hunger for admiration. Not political admiration. Personal admiration. Nero did not simply want to govern Rome. He wanted Rome to love him. He wanted applause, recognition, attention. And unlike previous emperors, he increasingly sought it not as a military leader or statesman, but as an artist. To Roman elites, this was deeply unsettling. In Roman culture, emperors conquered. They commanded armies. They led nations. Public performance belonged to actors, musicians, and entertainers, professions many aristocrats considered beneath imperial dignity. Nero disagreed. The emperor loved music, poetry, theater, public appearances, and with every passing year, his fascination grew stronger. At first, Romans tolerated it. Then they became uncomfortable. Then they became afraid. Because when an emperor develops an obsession, nobody can simply tell him no, especially when that emperor controls the world's most powerful state. Meanwhile, inside the imperial palace, relationships were beginning to fracture. Family members became rivals. Allies became threats. Friends became suspects. And Nero's growing need for admiration slowly transformed into something darker, something more dangerous. Paranoia. The boy who inherited the world was beginning to believe the world belonged only to him. As Nero's reign continued, the admiration he craved became harder to satisfy. Applause was no longer enough. Praise was no longer enough. The young emperor increasingly expected devotion, absolute devotion, and whenever he sensed criticism, disappointment, or resistance, his response became increasingly extreme. Inside the imperial palace, no relationship proved more complicated than the one between Nero and his mother. Agrippina the Younger had spent years helping secure her son's rise to power. Without her influence, Nero might never have become emperor at all. At first, she remained one of the most powerful figures in Rome, perhaps too powerful, because the more Nero embraced authority, the more he began viewing powerful people as threats, even when those people were family. Ancient historians describe a relationship that gradually deteriorated from cooperation into hostility. Agrippina reportedly expected influence over imperial decisions. Nero increasingly wanted independence. Neither side was willing to surrender control. The conflict grew. Rumors spread. Trust disappeared. And eventually, the emperor reached a horrifying conclusion. His own mother had become a problem. The stories surrounding Agrippina's death remain among the most infamous in Roman history. Ancient sources describe elaborate plans, failed attempts, and ultimately a violent end. Modern historians debate certain details, but the broader reality is difficult to dispute. Agrippina died, and Nero survived politically, for a time. Yet something important changed afterward, because removing rivals does not cure paranoia. It feeds it. Once an emperor begins eliminating perceived threats, every new crisis creates new suspects. Every disagreement becomes dangerous. Every criticism becomes personal. And Rome produced no shortage of criticism. Many aristocrats despised Nero's public performances. Senators questioned his priorities. Traditional elites viewed his artistic ambitions with embarrassment. Military leaders worried about imperial prestige. Nero responded by seeking even greater control. The result was a growing atmosphere of fear. Court officials monitored one another. Accusations multiplied. Political conspiracies, real and imagined, became increasingly common. Then came the event that changed everything. In July 64 AD, fire erupted in Rome. At first, it appeared manageable. Then the flames spread, and spread, and spread. 4 days, much of the city burned. Entire districts vanished. Thousands lost homes. Countless lives were disrupted. The capital of the Roman world descended into chaos. And as smoke filled the sky above Rome, a question emerged that would follow Nero forever. Who was responsible? The answer would become one of history's greatest controversies, and it would push the emperor even deeper into obsession. When the flames finally died, Rome barely recognized itself. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Temples stood in ruins. Families wandered through ashes searching for relatives, possessions, and answers. The disaster had shaken confidence in the empire, and more importantly, it had shaken confidence in Nero. The emperor understood the danger immediately. Disasters create questions. Questions create suspicion, and suspicion can destroy rulers. Ancient sources would later accuse Nero of everything from negligence to deliberate responsibility for the fire itself. Modern historians remain cautious about such claims. The evidence is complicated, contradictory, and often influenced by writers hostile to Nero. Yet one fact is difficult to ignore. Many Romans blamed him, and Nero desperately needed that blame to go somewhere else. Fast. Because while the city burned, the emperor had already begun imagining something extraordinary. A new Rome. His Rome. A rebuilt capital worthy of his vision. At the center of that vision stood an enormous palace complex later known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It would contain artificial lakes, gardens, marble halls, lavish decorations, statues of astonishing scale. The project reflected everything Nero increasingly wanted: beauty, admiration, grandeur, and himself. To supporters, it represented imperial ambition. To critics, it looked like vanity built upon disaster. The timing could not have been worse. Thousands of Romans had lost homes. The emperor was building a dream palace. The optics were disastrous. So Nero searched for another explanation, another target, another enemy. He found one among a small and unpopular religious group living inside the empire: Christians. At the time, Christianity remained relatively unknown. Its followers were viewed with suspicion by many Romans. Their beliefs seemed strange. Their refusal to participate in traditional religious practices made them easy targets. And suddenly, the blame had somewhere to go. Ancient accounts describe persecutions that shocked even some Roman observers. Christians were arrested, punished, and publicly displayed as examples. Whether every story survived accurately remains debated, but the broader reality is clear. Nero had found scapegoats. The fire that threatened his reputation was now connected to someone else's guilt, at least officially. But political survival came with a cost, because each act of repression deepened the emperor's isolation. The more Nero sought control, the less trust remained. The more he demanded loyalty, the less genuine loyalty he received. The more he pursued admiration, the more fear replaced it. And fear is a fragile foundation for power. By the late 60s AD, the empire was changing. The emperor still possessed immense authority. Yet beneath the surface, opposition was growing. In the Senate, among military leaders, within the provinces, and even inside Nero's inner circle. The obsession that once seemed eccentric was becoming dangerous, not only for Rome, for Nero himself. For years, fear had protected Nero. People obeyed because they were afraid. Officials remained loyal because they were afraid. Senators remained silent because they were afraid. But eventually, something happened that terrifies every ruler. People stopped being afraid enough. By the late 60s AD, the Roman Empire was becoming increasingly unstable. Nero's spending had reached extraordinary levels. Public projects consumed enormous resources. Political trust had collapsed. Relationships between the emperor and Rome's elite continued deteriorating. And beyond the capital, powerful men were beginning to ask dangerous questions. How much longer could this continue? The answer arrived in 68 AD. Far from Rome, rebellion erupted. Provincial governors began openly challenging imperial authority. Military leaders who once supported Nero started calculating their own futures. The empire that had once seemed completely under his control suddenly felt uncertain. For Nero, this was a nightmare. Not because rebellion was unusual. Rome had survived rebellions before. But because loyalty itself was beginning to disappear. One by one, allies drifted away. Supporters hesitated. Friends became cautious. Even members of the imperial administration started preparing for the possibility that Nero might not survive politically. The emperor responded the only way he knew, with suspicion, with fear, with attempts to identify traitors. But paranoia cannot stop momentum. It only accelerates isolation. The more Nero searched for enemies, the fewer allies remained. And then came the moment he never imagined possible. The Senate abandoned him. For years, senators had endured humiliation, intimidation, and political pressure. Now they saw an opportunity. Instead of defending the emperor, many chose survival. The political machine that had elevated Nero to power was now moving against him. Suddenly, the emperor who ruled the Roman world found himself increasingly alone. Messages arrived with bad news. Support was collapsing. Armies were changing sides. Authority was evaporating. And perhaps most frightening of all, nobody seemed willing to stop it. The man who once commanded an empire stretching from Britain to the Near East was discovering a brutal truth. Power exists only as long as others believe in it. And fewer people believed in Nero every day. As panic spread through the imperial palace, the emperor faced a choice. Fight, flee, or accept reality. He chose flight. Under cover of darkness, Nero left Rome, not as a conqueror, not as a beloved ruler, not as the artist he imagined himself to be, but as a fugitive. The downfall had begun, and the final chapter would be far more humiliating than anything his enemies could have imagined. In the final days of his life, Nero discovered something that terrified him more than rebellion: silence. 4 years, the emperor had surrounded himself with attention. Crowds, performances, ceremonies, praise, and spectacle shaped his world. He wanted admiration more than power itself. Now there was nobody left to applaud. As Nero hid outside Rome in June 68 AD, news continued arriving. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. His authority was gone. His empire was gone. His future was gone. The ruler of the Roman world had become a hunted man. Ancient sources describe Nero moving between panic and disbelief. He reportedly struggled to accept how quickly everything had collapsed. Only months earlier he remained emperor. Now former allies avoided him. Former supporters disappeared. Former friends protected themselves. The transformation was astonishing, not because Nero had lost power, because he had lost relevance. Rome was already preparing for life after Nero. The empire was moving on. Without him, as soldiers closed in, the emperor realized capture was becoming inevitable, and capture would not be merciful. Roman political culture could be brutal toward fallen rulers. Public humiliation, execution, and disgrace awaited those who lost power at the wrong moment. Nero understood this. He also understood something else. For all his flaws, he still wanted control over the ending. Ancient accounts describe the emperor preparing for death while struggling to act. Fear overwhelmed him. Hesitation delayed him. Loyal companions reportedly encouraged him to do what he could not bring himself to do alone. The contrast was striking. The man who once commanded legions now depended on a handful of frightened followers. The ruler who demanded applause could not even control his own final moments. Eventually, the end came. As approaching horsemen drew near, Nero took his own life with assistance from those still beside him. He was 30 years old. 30. The emperor who inherited the greatest empire on earth had ruled for 14 years, and in the end, almost nobody remained. Ancient writers preserved one final statement attributed to Nero: "What an artist dies in me." Whether the words are perfectly accurate no longer matters, because they capture something essential about his story. Nero's downfall was not caused solely by enemies, or conspiracies, or rebellion. It was caused by obsession. His need for admiration became vanity. Vanity became isolation. Isolation became paranoia. And paranoia destroyed everything. The boy who inherited the world spent his life demanding that Rome admire him. In the end, Rome simply walked away.